We'll be using a plugin called jQuery Rated. I provide a link to this plugin in the resource section of this lecture. It'll create a simple rating UI that we can use in our plugin. I actually already included this plugin for you when you downloaded the assets for our project. All we have to do now is include it. You already know how to do this, so why don't you pause the video and give it a try. This plugin can be found inside the assets folder. All you need to do is include the jQuery.rated.min.js and rated.css files. If you haven't figured it out, then let me show you. I'm going to use the WP-InQScripts action hook, and I'm calling the function r-InQScripts. I've included a file that will enqueue our files. Create a file named enqueue.php that will contain our function and include it from the plugin file. Keep in mind that I created a folder named front and put the file in here. One last thing I want to do is set the priority to a high number, such as 100. This here is a personal preference. Whenever I'm enqueuing files from within a plugin file, I like to load my assets last. This is because I believe themes should have a higher priority when it comes to loading JavaScript and CSS files. I've had many problems in the past where my assets had conflicting issues with themes because the theme files were being loaded too late. I've saved myself many headaches by having my plugin's asset files loaded last. Now let's take a look at this function. I'm simply going to register and enqueue my files. One thing I forgot to mention is I'm also enqueuing a script named main.js. This file can be found inside the assets/scripts folder. Open up this file. It's just basic jQuery code, which we will be editing soon. Back to the enqueue function, I'm doing one last thing, which is making sure that jQuery is being loaded before our files are loaded. This should set everything up, and we can now begin using the plugin. In the resource section, I provide a link to the AJAX and Plugins Codex page. This page goes over how to use AJAX and plugins. Using AJAX on the front end requires a little work. The first thing we need to do is prepare the data. Open up the recipe template file. As you can see, the rating is placed at the very bottom of the template. We created this div with the class rated. I also gave it an ID called recipe rating. We'll need this as a reference. I also added this attribute called data rated resettable and set its value to false. This will prevent the user from resetting their rating. All this information can be found on the documentation page of the plugin. The last attribute I created is called data RID. This will contain the ID of the current post. Taking a closer look, you'll notice I made this into a placeholder. Inside the filter function, let's add another modification. All you need to do is search for the placeholder and replace it with the ID of this post. Let's test this really quick. You should see 5 stars and be able to rate this recipe. This works almost perfect. As you can see, you're able to change your rating. We don't want this. We want the rating to be set after the user has done so. We'll do this inside the JavaScript main file. I'm going to select the div by its ID, and then I'm going to bind an event called rated. This event is called when the user rates a recipe. Inside the function, we can use the this object to reference the div. I'm going to select the div again and call the rated method. This method allows us to change the properties. I'm going to change the read-only property to true. This will prevent the user from changing the rating after a rating is made. The next step is to create an object called form. We're going to send this object when we make an AJAX request. There's only one property we must define, which is the action property. WordPress will use this to determine what function to execute when it receives an AJAX request. You'll see exactly how this works in just a moment. I'm going to set this to rRateRecipe. Next, I'm going to create a RID property and set its value to the RID attribute. The last property we want to define is the rating itself. To grab the rating, we can use the rated method and pass in the value. This will return the rating. I want to test this out really quick. Refresh the page and try rating the recipe. You should not be able to rate this recipe after rating it once. The next step is to send an AJAX request with all our info so the rating can be saved. The WordPress admin provides a variable for the AJAX URL. On the front end, we're not so lucky. We actually have to generate the URL ourselves. It's pretty easy though. Inside the enqueue function, we're going to use a function called WP localize script. This function is used for providing translated strings to your JavaScript files. Despite that, WordPress actually recommends you use this function for also providing a URL to its AJAX page handler. The first parameter is which files will be receiving the translations or URLs. Set this to our main since this is the file that we're using to send AJAX requests. Next up is the name of the object we can use for referencing the values. I'm going to set this to recipe obj. The last parameter is an array of values. We only need to create one value, and this is the AJAX URL. You can name this whatever you want, by the way. The value of this key will be the URL returned by the admin URL function. This function has one optional parameter, which is the path relative to the WordPress admin URL. I'm going to pass in admin.ajax.php. This is the path that should always handle your AJAX requests. If we take a look at our folder structure, you can actually find this file inside the WP admin folder. Now we can send an AJAX request. Using jQuery's post method, we'll send an AJAX request to the URL we generated. Remember, the recipe object is the name we used in the second parameter of the localize function. This object will contain all our array's values. The property we want to access is the AJAX URL property. Next, we want to send the form object, and then we'll create the function that will handle the response. The data argument is a variable that will contain the response body. The last thing we need to do is actually tell WordPress about the AJAX request so we can handle it properly. From the plugin file, we're going to use an action hook called WP AJAX. Let's take a look at this hook by viewing its codex page. I provide a link to this in the resource section of this lecture. This hook starts with WP AJAX, followed by the name of the action. This was set in the form object, so the action hook should be called WP AJAX rRateRecipe. The name of the function we want to execute is rRateRecipe. You can name this whatever you want. You don't have to name it after the action. I just do it like this because it makes things easier to manage. Alright, now create a file inside the process folder called raterecipe.php and define the function here. Make sure to include it from the plugin file. Inside the function, I'm going to output the post data. Let's try using our rating system now. There's one problem, which is how do we know if our data is being sent, and how do we check the data? This can be done by using the Chrome developer tools. Press F12 on your keyboard and you should see this pop up. In previous lectures, we briefly went over how the elements and console tabs work. Now we'll be discussing how the network tab works. The network tab keeps track of what files are loaded and how long it takes to load these files. It also provides information about the request and the responses. For the most part, I don't usually concern myself with all of this information. The best part about this section of the developer tools is that you can filter these requests, since a web page can make dozens of requests. I'm going to filter it by XHR, which stands for XML HTTP requests. This is where AJAX requests are displayed. With this being displayed, I'm going to rate the recipe. After clicking this recipe, you should see a new request being sent to admin.ajax.php. Click on this request and you will see some data being outputted. To the right, it's categorized into 5 sections. The headers tab tells us about the header information. Inside this tab, it's split into more sections. The general section provides information about the request in general. The response headers provides information about the server itself when it replied to a request. The request headers provides information about our own request. The form data is what we want to see specifically. You'll notice our data being sent, so we can now confirm that our request is indeed being sent with the data we provided. Next, I want to check if the server is receiving this data properly. Under the Preview or Response tab, we'll be able to check out the server's response. We see our data being outputted with PHP. Not only have we confirmed that our data is being sent, but the correct function is being executed when the data is received. Before I move on, there's one thing I want to highlight. The difference between the Preview and Response tab is that the Preview tab will display the response as if the response was rendered by a browser. So any stylings applied to the responses page will be applied to this later preview. The Response tab will show the response completely raw and/or plain text. There's one last thing I want to do before we move on to processing the rating. Back inside the main plugin file, I'm going to copy the AJAX hook again and paste it below. I'm going to change WP AJAX to WP AJAX no priv. The difference between these two is that the no priv version will also process AJAX requests from users who are not logged in. No priv stands for no privileges. We want our guests to be able to rate our recipes as well. This step is optional and is up to you whether you believe guests should be able to make AJAX requests. You don't have to worry about both of these being triggered, as WordPress is smart enough to tell which one to use depending on the user. In the next lecture, we'll actually process the data and save it.